What's up, everybody? It's just about 12 o'clock here. I think it's time to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get through today and a great turnout. So really appreciate you all taking the time out to eat a sandwich with us while we talk about grid interactive efficient buildings, a new acronym alert, GEBs, another word for smart buildings. We're going to hear more about what this new term precisely means as we get going here, but this comes at a time of increased focus. We're heading into the summer cooling season, another big wildfire season in front of us, I hate to say, and probably a drought. So our buildings need to be smart. We need to be turning our buildings into a resource and from a liability. And this is the roadmap to do that. So we have a great set of speakers today that are going to really dive deep on this topic. I'm Dave. I get to do the intro here today and quickly hand it over to our speakers. We have a great, again, roster here today. Thanks to DWP, as always, and SoCalGas for sponsoring this webinar and all of our educational content and the work that we do. We appreciate your continued partnership, and I can't believe it's been 10 years running this program, and so we really appreciate the ongoing support for the LABBC and this community that we're trying to build. Housekeeping, we're going to keep things orderly, just lines muted, plenty of time, I hope, for questions at the end. If we're not able to get to all of them, we will get back to you via email, and we're going to be sprinkling some really awesome resources through the chat, and those will be compiled with the follow-up recording and slides and all that good stuff for you on Friday, which is tomorrow. And we want to hear how we did. So we want to make this fun. Today is going to be a lot of content, but again, hoping to keep it pretty fun, light, and informational for everybody. So let's get into it. I won't read the agenda. Speaker introductions. We've got 4 guest speakers today. 2 co-presenters, Andy Satchwell from Berkeley Lab and Ryan Hledik, who's a principal at Brattle Group. They collaborated with Berkeley Lab on the GEBs national roadmap, and they've been on a road show with that for the past few weeks, and they're doing a special presentation of that for us, which I'm really excited about, in collaboration with David Jacot, Director of Efficiency Solutions at DWP. He is the man figuring out what GEBs mean here in LA and how does this come together from the utility side. And my friend and colleague, Kevin Powell from the Green Proving Ground at the US General Services Administration, biggest landlord in the nation. I think that's still true, probably. And they've been doing a lot of this work and really, leading edge is where Kevin lives. And so he'll be giving us some reports from the field. So with that, I will hand it over to Ryan and Andy to take us through the national roadmap. Welcome, guys. Thanks again for doing this.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, David. Great to be here. Great to be speaking with everyone. Happy to be joined by my co-author on the national roadmap, Andy Satchwell. We're going to give you a quick overview of the roadmap today. It's a 150-page report, which by DOE standards is pretty concise, but obviously we won't have time to go through all of that detail here. So we're just going to talk through the highlights. For those of you that are interested in more detail, the report is available at gebroadmap.lbl.gov. For those of you who aren't tired of listening to Andy and me by the end of this webinar, on that website, we also have some recordings of some longer presentations that we've done that provide a little more detail. So, those are a couple of those resources that David was referencing in his comments. But in the interest of time, why don't we just jump straight into it? So if we can move to the next slide. The first question that we want to answer here as we talk about GEBs and the roadmap is, why do we want buildings to be more efficient and flexible? And the answer to that question is because buildings really have the capability to do a lot of the things that the grid needs today and will need in greater quantities in the future. So flexible, efficient buildings can integrate renewable resources. Load flexibility, energy efficiency allow us to defer the costs of investments in electricity system infrastructure. Both efficiency and flexibility additionally will facilitate achieving these increasingly aggressive decarbonization goals that have been seen not just in California, but in various states around the country. And then lastly, and I think this is maybe the benefit or the reason for doing GEBs that often gets overlooked is better performing buildings can optimize energy use based on customer preferences and provide benefits to consumers in ways that haven't been possible previously. So this is all to say that if we're making buildings more efficient, more flexible, they can benefit owners, the occupants of those buildings, and the electric grid more broadly. Next slide, please. So we've talked about why, but what is a GEB? What is a grid interactive efficient building? When I first came to this, my understanding was really what we're talking about is energy efficiency and demand response for residential buildings and commercial buildings. And that's true, but when we talk about the GEB vision, it's really about more than that. And so there are 4 characteristics that define a GEB. DOE always leads with efficiency. GEBs are energy efficient buildings that take advantage of new and impactful energy efficiency measures. Second, they're connected. This is a technology-based solution. So it involves technologies that can communicate with each other, can communicate with the grid, and can communicate with consumers. Third, GEBs are smart. So this is we're not just talking about static energy savings. We're talking about technologies that are able to leverage sensors and controls to optimize efficiency and flexibility relative to the preferences of building occupants. And then lastly, buildings are flexible. I think the traditional view of energy efficiency is just kind of give me a reduction in energy use, don't really care when, don't really care where or how we get it, we just want to reduce overall consumption. There are definitely benefits associated with conservation, but the focus with GEBs is not just to reduce use, but to reduce use at the times when it's most valuable to do so. And that's where this load flexibility angle comes in as well. We're trying to target overall energy savings, but also to get those savings at times when they're most beneficial to the grid and to consumers. So next slide, please. Those are just, kind of a couple background slides on GEBs to make sure that we're all coming to this with the same basic understanding of what that 3-letter acronym means. Now, just to spend 1 minute on the roadmap, this roadmap was released, I guess, I think it was last month. It was released with an announcement by the Energy Secretary. And the roadmap follows a pretty classical organization as far as roadmaps go. First, in the report, we established an estimate of the value that GEBs can provide to the power system and ultimately to consumers. So that's the opportunity. Then we provide a high-level vision for GEB technology features and how all of this can get integrated. And once we've established this opportunity and kind of the long-term view on how this will look, then we talk about barriers. What is keeping us from realizing that opportunity and achieving those benefits? And then lastly, and this is really where the bulk of those 150 pages are focused, what are the options for overcoming the barriers? What are the actions that all industry stakeholders can take to push the ball forward and make buildings more efficient and more flexible and more beneficial to consumers? So this was, basically a year in the making. We ended up interacting and getting input from well over 100 practitioners, researchers, regulators, et cetera, in the development of the roadmap. So it really is intended not just to lay out options for all industry stakeholders, but also to reflect the input of those stakeholders in the development of the report. So that's an overview. And now we'll talk just for a minute on that quantification of the opportunity. What is the value of national adoption of GEBs? So we did some pretty detailed bottom-up modeling, collaborative effort between LBNL, DOE, and the Brattle Group. And through that bottom-up modeling, we came up with an estimate that GEBs could save up to $18 billion per year in avoided power system costs by 2030, And looking out over 20 years, that could amount to between $100 and $200 billion in cost savings over that 2-decade period. So the chart on the left just kind of summarizes a few different modeling scenarios that we considered when we were analyzing the benefits. And you can see that, based on different assumptions about the extent to which GEB technologies are adopted or the extent to which the power grid evolves over time, those value estimates can vary, but pretty much across the board, across all of those scenarios that we analyzed, the benefits that we're talking about here, the cost savings are pretty significant. The chart on the right is showing you, sorry, if we could just stay on the previous slide for a couple more seconds. The chart on the right is showing you the extent to which national adoption of GEBs could increase levels of energy efficiency savings relative to what we've achieved historically. So over the past 10 years, we've gotten to about 220 terawatt hours of energy savings through voluntary energy efficiency programs. Based on our modeling, national adoption of GEBs could double or even triple that if we get really aggressive about getting customers to adopt these technologies. So there's a significant opportunity here to go above and beyond what has been happening historically in the energy efficiency and demand response space. And actually, based on this analysis, at the time of the release of the roadmap, DOE announced a goal to triple energy efficiency and demand flexibility in buildings over the course of the next decade. So these are pretty big numbers we're talking about here. If we could go to the next slide, those were estimates of the cost savings and the potential impacts in terms of megawatt hours or megawatts. We also wanted to take a look at what this can mean in terms of emissions reductions. And there, what we've estimated is that nationally, GEBs could save about 80 million tons of carbon dioxide annually by 2030, which is about 6% of all power sector CO2 emissions. So just voluntary adoption of these measures among residential and commercial consumers could reduce power sector emissions by 6%. That's equivalent to retiring about 50 medium-sized coal plants or taking 17 million combustion engine light-duty vehicles off the road. Now, one takeaway here is that these results do vary by region, and that's what we're showing in the chart on this slide. So as you can imagine, some regions like the Midwest have basically a higher carbon content of their power generation than California or parts of the Northeast or the Pacific Northwest. So the opportunity to save carbon is different across regions, but that doesn't mean that it isn't significant across the US. And I think, the other just sort of comment that I'll make about this chart is this chart's really focused on energy savings. What are the carbon benefits associated with energy savings? And in a location like California, where power supply has already become significantly decarbonized, whereas those benefits from energy efficiency might be lower, what this is also highlighting is the opportunity for fuel switching and electrification to provide additional environmental benefits as well. That's the kind of the turning point that you get to once you've reached the type of power supply decarbonization that's been achieved in California. So that's the emissions story. And then we have, just one slide where we wanted to acknowledge that a lot of these benefits that we've quantified, these sound like big numbers, but as we step back and looked at the analysis, we actually concluded that these are pretty conservative estimates. And there are a number of potential additional sources of value that GEBs could provide that could significantly increase these forecasts. So we haven't accounted, for example, for the benefit of deferring the need to invest in distribution capacity to serve new load growth. We haven't fully accounted for the avoided costs associated with meeting RPS targets. There are other benefits associated with the value of demand flexibility and energy efficiency in extreme conditions, like we've seen in Texas and California recently, that aren't represented here. Other consumer benefits as well. And lastly, and something that we want to highlight is, while the GEB roadmap itself focuses broadly on how a broad range of technologies and buildings could provide these benefits, the quantitative analysis was focused pretty heavily on energy efficiency and demand response, and rolling in, defining the analysis more broadly to also include behind the meter generation, behind the meter storage, electric vehicles, rolling in some additional distributed energy resources into the analysis could significantly increase those value estimates as well, and is something that we hope to see explored in further research. So that is the opportunity. And now I'll turn it over to my co-presenter, Andy, to talk through the vision and some of the opportunities to push the ball forward.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. So now that Ryan made this a very compelling opportunity, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean in more detail about what GEBs look like when implemented, and conclude with some recommendations that we laid out for different stakeholders. So, if it's not evident already, one of the kind of key pieces of GEBs in the field is really combining attributes of energy efficiency with demand flexibility capabilities. So for example, something like networked lighting controls, where you get efficiency gains from more efficient lighting, but controls allow you to use occupancy sensors and other controls to move that lighting load into times when the grid might need it. And that's just one of many examples. So conceptually, we developed this figure here on the right to describe different layers of systems that are important to take into consideration when deploying GEBs. The report goes into a lot more detail on this figure. I think there's really two things that I wanted to point out, which are particularly important. One is that technology integration is really important, and that is both integration between the layers that you see here. So about maximizing performance and avoiding conflict between competing objectives, say needs among physical systems versus what's being called for to sort of a supervisory control level. And then integration as well across multiple end uses to take advantage of those synergies between end use systems. Interoperability is really a key theme here. You'll see us kind of touch on that a little bit in the recommendations, but to have that plug and play ability between these types of systems is really important. The other thing I want to point out is that box to the left of the linkage to additional DERs. While the roadmap focused particularly on building energy efficiency and demand flexibility, integrating the building loads with DERs like PV, EV, and storage can further enhance the demand flexibility capability of the building, and it's really a key part of the GEB vision. Next slide, please. So what we did was we wanted to talk a little bit in the report about what are some of the kind of key technologies, both that are commercially available and more importantly, those that are being deployed in more limited pilots and in development. So we did an expert survey, reached out to some building technology experts, and kind of tried to lay out some of these high opportunity technologies, as you can see here in this figure. I mean, obviously things like smart thermostats, automated window attachments, and efficient and grid connected water heaters are available today and can provide a significant piece of the demand flexibility opportunity that Ryan laid out. At the same time, there's a whole host of technologies, exciting ones that are in development. Particularly we called out thermal energy storage as a large opportunity for demand flexibility that's still in development or being deployed in fairly limited pilots. And there's also a large number of supervisory and local control technologies that are in development and probably need more widespread deployment to realize all the GEB opportunity, again, to deal with the integration piece that I described in the previous slide. Go to the next slide. So, before you talk about any recommendations, it's always good to establish what are the barriers and to really try and tie recommendations to barriers that exist that need to be overcome in order to maximize the value of GEBs. So we developed this value chain that sort of describes the process from development all the way to utilization of the GEBs. So thinking about just development, really specific to building technologies and controls, this really pertains to software and hardware developers and researchers. And there's some quite often cited barriers of lack of standardization and interoperability, as well as I just mentioned, kind of nascent technology development like around thermal storage that could provide some of that additional flexibility. The next step in the value chain is deployment of these technologies. And this really faces installers, aggregators, or ESCOs, as well as utilities. These are barriers that face them. Those might include, restrictive wholesale market rules, so kind of institutional and market barriers, as well as the fact that energy efficiency and demand flexibility may be underrepresented or undervalued in utility planning, which limits some of the opportunities. Adoption of these measures is obviously really important, as you saw in what Ryan described as far as the dollar opportunity. One of the biggest sensitivities in the analysis was our adoption assumptions. We sort of had a low, medium, and high. That produced a pretty big range of results. So to really get to that high adoption level, you need to overcome barriers to consumers and building owners and managers around perhaps an insufficient value proposition or lack of awareness or understanding of these opportunities. It's a pretty complex and expensive undertaking in some instances. And so those barriers need to be addressed to drive greater adoption. And then utilization, I mean, these are resources, right, that the grid can take advantage of. And so utilities, system operators like ISOs and RTOs, all face certain barriers as far as utilization of this, whether they don't trust demand flexibility as a resource that can be called upon sort of reliably. And sometimes utilities or system operators lack certain incentives to pursue energy efficiency and demand flexibility over those traditional investments. And then, we wanted to recognize the fact that there's regulation support and facilitation that kind of sits underneath all of this and this entire value chain related to the role that state, federal policymakers and regulators, as well as advocacy groups and researchers play. Some of the barriers that they face are status quo bias or lack of solid information upon which to base their decisions and policies. So next slide. Now that we've talked about the barriers, so what we did was we developed 14 recommendations in the roadmap and organized them into 4 pillars to try and kind of thematically put these together. And for each one of the 14 recommendations, we had a whole host of example and suggested key actions. I've just included one here. We can get into more detail later on in the Q&A. But at a fairly high level, the first pillar is really about advancing GEBs through research and development. This is really traditional RD&D, research and development and deployment of these technologies. So whether that's just actually, performing some of that research and development and accelerated deployment of those technologies that I mentioned earlier that are in development and with high demand flexibility potential, or focusing around technology interoperability, or even collecting and providing data or developing methods to benchmark and evaluate demand flexibility performance. A lot of it's about expanding what we're doing on the energy efficiency side to include demand flexibility. Next slide, please. The second pillar is about enhancing the value of GEBs to consumers and utilities. And I imagine David can speak a little bit more about it on the utility and consumer side. But certainly this is about expanding and innovating both incentive-based programs. So these would be things like a monthly rebate, for participation in a load control program, or price-based programs, right? So things like time of use rates, critical peak pricing, and really planning for those to be full-scale deployment rather than kind of one-off pilots. We also recognize and included recommendations around incentives for utilities to deploy demand flexibility resources, as well as incorporating demand flexibility into utility resource planning. So it actually represents the value that it can to reduce capacity, reduce energy and other system costs. Next slide. The third pillar focused on the user and operations, so and ways to empower them. So I like to think of this a little bit of like the Amazon Prime Day of GEBs, right? So how do users actually interact with technologies? And if you look at the types of things that are advertised on Amazon, there's a lot of thought that goes into the user experience there, and that these products are really designed to be attractive and to be things that people want to purchase. And so how can we leverage some of that experience for things like building technologies? So understanding how users interact with GEBs, the role of technology, developing tools to support decision-making by owners, by customers, as well as designers. And then workforce development is a huge piece of this, right? This is complex stuff, it's new, it's cutting edge. And so how can we leverage existing building-related workforce programs to bring in more of this advanced technology and interoperability type training? Go to the last slide. So the final pillar is around supporting GEB deployment through state and federal enabling programs and policies. So one clear example, and I think this is something that the GSA is really leading on, is lead by example. So government and public sector building participation in these types of demand response and EE programs and markets, and actually deploying these technologies in the field successfully. Other recommendations in this pillar that we offered include expanding funding and financing options. So modifying, perhaps some of the success we've had around financing for energy efficiency. Also expanding codes and standards to include demand flexibility, maybe having grid interactive requirements and open standards for communication. And then finally, considering implementing demand flexibility in state targets or mandates. Some states are starting to explore actually having a specific target for demand flexibility, either statewide or utility specific. So I think that with that kind of concludes our piece of it. David, I think I'm going to hand it off to you at this point.
Thank you, Ryan and Andy. That was great. You guys covered a lot in a very short time. I got a huge list of questions going here already, but I think we're probably going to cover most of those as we get through the rest of our other speakers. So David Jacot, thank you for joining us this afternoon, Director of Efficiency Solutions at LADWP. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Dave. Happy to be here. Thanks to everybody for joining us today for this exciting topic. I like to lead off with this slide here, just to kind of set the context here in California. So as I'll drill into where the GEBs fit into our planning here, but this is the emissions profile in California, and we're trying to decarbonize the economy here. And you can see that buildings, residential, commercial comprise 12, and that's on-site emissions, typically natural gas use, and transportation is 41%. That's massive. So I always and industrial is 23. So I always kind of like to look at this for context in terms of where the massive decarbonization efforts really need to be. Buildings serve up an opportunity, but transportation is obviously the big the big score here. Let's go on to the next slide. So we have been working to figure out how to decarbonize the electricity supply in Los Angeles. And the reason I set the context on the previous slide is that electrification is a big part of that. We've looked at what it would take to electrify transportation and buildings, and it more than doubles our retail kilowatt hours, the amount of energy we sell. We generally retail about 24,000 gigawatt hours of electricity every year. Fully electrifying transportation and buildings takes us close to 60. And in fact, maybe over 60,000, 62,000 gigawatt hours a year. That's 2.5 times how much energy we retail today. So when we talk about decarbonizing our grid, we can't just look at the static load we serve today. We have the conventional load. We have to look at the impacts of electrification as well. So in that spirit, we commissioned the city, and NREL worked together to create the LA 100 study. And that's 100% renewable, 100% decarbonized energy by 2035. And so this study was released to the public on March 24th, 2021. And it's a scenario analysis, basically. It's not a potential study, it's a scenario analysis. And it identified multiple pathways to get to completely renewable, completely decarbonized electricity by 2035. And so it identified also what the cost of that might be. And it estimated the cost to be between $50 and $80 billion. Now that's a big range. 50 billion is a lot, 80 billion is a lot more. So what's the difference? And that's the range of pathways and the range of scenarios. Well, turns out the lowest cost pathway depends heavily on energy efficiency, demand response and flexibility, on-site solar and storage, building electrification, and electric vehicle chargers, with them all eventually being integrated into grid interactive efficient buildings. The way I like to say it, energy efficiency is foundational to all of it. It helps make everything else smaller in the system, but so are the rest of the distributed energy resources. And then when you tie them together to really make smart buildings, or GEBs as we're calling them now, it really combines to push us to that 50 billion range as opposed to the 80 billion range. And I can tell you, it's not going to cost $30 billion to do GEBs properly. So, for a relatively modest investment in GEBs throughout our service territory, we can get to the low end of that significant investment range. In fact, and I don't have a chart on this, but we have identified that the the rate impacts of this transition, for the most part, track inflation. That's significant. If we do this right, with the combination of electrification, specifically of transportation, but to a lesser extent buildings, our revenue increases from shifting, people buying gasoline over to people paying for electricity at a much lower rate, by the way, makes all this affordable, and it tracks inflation. So, it's so important to tie these things together intelligently to drive ourselves to the lower end of the range of this transition that has to happen. Now I'm going to talk about, next slide, please. This is our first foray into program design specifically to accommodate this. And the idea here is to create a scalable, expandable, modular platform program that ties all of the distributed energy resources together, and also lays the groundwork for fully integrating GEBs. So we're in the process of launching our comprehensive affordable multifamily program, and this is targeting, as it sounds, multifamily units in either low income, affordable properties throughout the city, in disadvantaged communities or not, just as long as they're primarily low income. And what we're trying to do here is achieve deep decarbonization of these buildings. So it goes beyond energy efficiency. This program rolls together energy efficiency, electrification, and on-site solar in its initial launch state. And we're pulling this together. We're launching this as we speak. And the idea there is that by combining those three, energy efficiency, building electrification, and on-site solar, you can keep the energy costs, the energy burden, either neutral or negative, in other words, going down, while deeply decarbonizing the building. But the platform we're building for this program, let's go back a little bit. The platform we're building allows us to readily expand it into demand response and flexibility, electric vehicle chargers, on-site storage, and other applications, water efficiency for that matter too, that allow us to really dive deep into all what we call the distributed energy resources, and at the same time make them grid enabled and interconnected, and really get those optimized benefits of GEBs. This program I'm super excited about. We've been talking about it. I've been talking about it for a couple of years now, especially the last year in earnest, and we're in the launch phase now. This program I see as the template for how we should be operating all of our customer distributed energy resource programs going forward. So this is where we're really getting the rubber meeting the road. It's not launching specifically as GEBs, but it's setting up the framework for that. How do the DER offerings work together? How do we offer them in an optimized manner to our customers? And then how can we overlay the GEB capability? And then how can we expand that to all of our customer offerings? So it's nascent. We're just starting with this, but we expect to see some pretty quick results. We've already got a tremendous amount of interest, and hopefully in a year or two, I can come back and have some success stories to tell. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dave, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you, David. That was fantastic, and I'm super excited to work together on the rollout of CAMR, and it is indeed an awesome template. And the work you've done on the back end, I just want to acknowledge for the group in staffing up to support this, working across the different programs that are involved. I don't want to underplay that. So the department really has geared up in a huge way to support the types of comprehensive multi-measure programs that we're, project scopes that we're talking about here. So just wanted to give you a shout out for that.
All right, thank you, Dave. Appreciate it.
All right. So lessons from the field. The GSA has been really leading in the areas of smart buildings and technology integration, and really, pushing the market for years. And Kevin Powell, who's joining us today, has been a huge part of that. So Kevin, thank you for joining us to share some of your early reports back from the field.
Great, thank you. And of course, right behind me is the vacation I just left behind in order to come and talk to all of you today. Anyway, well, thanks for that introduction. And I got to say, this has been just a really inspiring kind of set of speakers so far. And I attend a lot of these things. It's nice to see, actually, to learn some new things today. I want to underscore a couple of things that we've heard from Ryan, Andy, and David. And the first of these is that the scope of this GEB, this grid interactive efficient building, it's actually at this point reasonably well defined. The other thing is that the majority of the technologies that we need to deliver a GEB, they're here. And second thing is just that GEB do, and I think that's sort of should be apparent from some of these previous slides, they hold a lot of benefit, not just to the grid operator, but to the facility owner as well. And GSA is a facility owner. As Dave said in the intro, we're the landlord for the civilian federal government, operating all those federal buildings that you may be familiar with, courthouses, office buildings, land ports of entry, and so on. It adds up to about 370 million square feet of space, about 8,800 properties. And that is, as Dave said, the largest single portfolio of commercial real estate in the US. So we have a lot of interest in how do we manage that efficiently. We would have that interest even if we weren't strapped for money, but we are strapped for money because we know how the government is kind of doesn't have a lot of money, really, honestly, for these kinds of things. So, and I also want to thank Andy for his shout out because although it might not always seem like it, the federal government has really a pretty robust track record in leading by example, of really being out front. And at GSA, some examples, long list of firsts. Honestly, we were the first commercial real estate organization to require drawings to be submitted in a digital DXF form, the first to adopt LEED as a requirement for all new construction, the first to adopt BIM standards and some smart building standards. And we're positioning ourselves to be out front in adopting a comprehensive GEB strategy. In the words of Secretary of Energy Granholm, the time has come to deliver on our promises, to meet the moment, I think is the way she put it. And what I want to highlight in the next few slides and a few minutes is some real world examples of how we're meeting that GEB moment. So, GSA does things like everybody else, I would assume, relatively intentionally. The first step on our pathway towards GEB was that really the great work that we've just heard from our DOE counterparts here. They really have been developing and promoting this idea of GEB for at this point a couple of years. We're aware of that from them. We recognize the opportunity, and then based on that opportunity, we consulted some outside experts, because that's what we do, to develop some recommendations. Is there really a there, so to speak, in this GEB? DOE said so. We wanted to ask folks if they thought that was really true for our particular portfolio, and the answer came back yes. So then next step along that pathway is that we said, all right, well, let's get real about this. Let's look at our portfolio. Let's really do essentially a feasibility analysis and really lay out a path forward. Since we think there is an opportunity, we hired Rocky Mountain Institute to do that for us. And just to sort of frame what that opportunity looks like, on a $330 million energy spend, annual energy spend, RMI essentially, through a fairly comprehensive modeling analysis, somewhat similar to what DOE showed earlier, that savings opportunity was about 50 million. So, I mean, we're talking about 25% of our energy spend we felt under current tariffs would essentially be reduced by adopting a GEB strategy. And that is a cost-effective, these were all cost-effective measures. That's under current tariffs. And I think what you just heard from Dave there is that I think that utilities are going to honestly incentivize GEBs even more going forward. It's just, it is what closes that gap of what we're facing in terms of our costs. So I saw that the link went up there. We published a blueprint that really provides a framework for us to move forwards. And then really, this is sort of much more about my program that I lead, which is called Green Proving Ground. We look at the pieces that are perhaps less ready for prime time. We'll talk a little bit more about what those are, and then make sure that they actually can work in the real world. So next slide. Again, underscoring this fact that we actually have a lot of the technologies already in place. What that blueprint document envisions and what we actually piloted prior to publishing the blueprint document was that a lot of these systems, that is to say, everything but that layer of supervisory controls, the bottom three boxes in Andy's slide, local control, sensing and actuation, physical systems, these things are all ready to go. That's what makes a GEB ready building. And they're actually, again, super cost effective. So in these three examples that you can see here, these are the ECMs that we introduced. These are financed by an energy service company, an ESCO. So that is to say, they all have good payback where they couldn't be financed that way. So next slide. So just a couple of words about what this Green Proving Ground program that I lead is all about, and what are we really looking at? And this is really, of course, what I really want. It's my own happy place, let's just say. The Green Proving Ground program takes first user risk for GSA. That is to say, we bridge the gap between innovative, great ideas that have made it out of the lab and they seem ready for full commercialization, to that promised land of broad market adoption. That's what I want to say, not adaptation, but in some ways, yes, that too. How do we do that? We do that by providing real world objective M&V data that gives our facility operators confidence that this next generation technology is going to actually work in their building, is going to deliver for their tenants. There's when you have something as big and complicated as a building, you don't want to put something in that puts any of that expensive equipment or your tenant satisfaction at risk. So in 2020, we publish an RFI annually, and I probably should plug to everybody here that we will be publishing one this year in October. This year's topic is going to be net zero carbon buildings. So if you have innovative technologies you think should participate in a testbed program like ours, please look for that RFI or shoot me a note afterwards and I'll ping you when the RFI is published. But back in 2020, the topic was GEB. And more specifically, that layer of supervisory controls, because that was the piece and is the piece that is the least well developed and the one that really needs some field validation. We had 35 vendor teams that submitted technical proposals. 11 were selected as semi-finalists, and we selected 3 for testbed evaluation at GSA facilities. We're about to kick all of those test beds off. somewhat delayed because of COVID. We are confident that if we came back this time next year, we probably have much to report. This gives a top level snapshot of what those three are, but the next three slides will give this in a bit more detail why we picked those three. So first one here is, I guess you could say it takes a holistic approach. Operate buildings for the people in them. That's, if I were to summarize it in a nutshell, that's what it does. And the idea here is that if you know in real time how many people are in the building right now and where in the building they are, you can operate that building to provide for their best comfort and health, actually. To make this work, there's a, I guess you could say the secret sauce here is really an extraordinary amount of interoperability and converging in real time a lot of information. Like there's essentially all sorts of front of house data, from people counting sensors to air quality sensors, light sensors, temperature and humidity sensors, all of that, with back of house data that tracks the real time performance of building equipment, the chillers, the lighting energy, the status of energy generation and storage that's on site, some outside information, the utility costs, the weather, and so on. So then you sort of watch how facility operators are currently optimizing their facility operation. That's what this software does. And it learns that. This is a, again, it's a machine learning based technology. It starts by making suggestions for the operator and says, this is how we think you could operate your building more efficiently, more effectively. It sees which ones the operators actually use. It applies more machine learning, makes better suggestions, and then hopefully you get to a place where the operator has sufficient confidence in these suggestions that they turn that entire supervisory control over to the software to do autonomously within some well-defined parameters. Bottom line is that we think if this proves out, it has the potential to deliver really better building performance, much more occupant friendly, climate friendly, grid friendly. And actually it has a good bit of potential to operate our buildings that we're looking at a post-pandemic world of hybrid workplaces that I think is going to have a level of dynamic occupancy that is going to be challenging relative to how things were previously. Certainly we're not going to be in a 9-to-5 world like we were. Next slide. This one, I really like this. It's an entirely different strategy. It's a gamified approach. The idea here is that if you empower facility managers with data that will help them operate their facilities in a way that is more grid efficient and effective, and you track that according to some common metrics, that can foster an environment of friendly sporting competition with other facility operators. I think of this as kind of a better Strava, or Strava for facility managers. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Strava. During the pandemic, I've really gotten into cycling, and knowing how I'm doing and comparing what I'm doing to how others who I know are doing, and seeing what they're doing and seeing what I'm doing, well, it does inspire me. And that is really, that's the idea for this software.
Almost like a Better Buildings challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It fact is, yeah. But I actually anyway, I'm excited. I love all of my children, so to speak, equally. But that one is definitely one that I'm excited to see how it turns out, because it's in some ways a very low touch. It doesn't require that supervisory control, but it empowers people to be working at their best. And so then the last one I'm going to talk about is this one, which is, I think you could think of this as your personal assistant, or perhaps more like a Nest thermostat on steroids. This one, the idea here is that it's really easy to install with minimal upfront setup. It's really easy to interact with, and again, what it's trying to do within actually a slightly more narrow band of data and control than the first one we saw. But it's essentially automating. It's another machine learning based. Actually, all of these have some machine learning component, but this is a very machine learning oriented one. And it automates how you are essentially like a Nest thermostat. It looks at what you do. It automates what you do. It looks at what you override and learns from that. The notion is to make it easy to do your job at your best. Provide effective data visualization and reporting to demonstrate that you're doing your job at your best. And, for the nerds out there, the developer's hunch is that there's going to be a community of nerds that are going to add to the open source software that this is built on and improve it. All right, so last slide. This is that GEB blueprint that we referenced earlier, and I do encourage all of you to take a look at that document, because it's our implementation of DOE's roadmap is I guess the way you might think of that. And so with that, I think we turn this over to questions.
We do. Thank you, Kevin and David and Andy and Ryan. This was a really exciting series of conversations. I've learned a ton. So we do have some questions coming in. Oh, and I had a couple slides just to tie this together and just to put it out there to the group. We're working on this here in LA. You heard, David, this is a major priority here. So we do have a joint initiative going with US DOE and NREL, DWP, SoCalGas, and the city to simplify this, right, through the Better Buildings Challenge. We're providing a partnership model to help work across all of the different opportunities here, take advantage of the expertise. So if you're interested in plugging into that, just wanted to do a quick plug. And also for our building technology showcase, that'll be coming up in November. And I'm excited to partner with Kevin again. But we'll be zooming in and featuring fast pitch presentations from some of these companies whose technologies are being out there deployed now, if you want to learn more. So that will all be in the follow-up. But these are just a little plug to, if you're interested, you want to join this group, please do reach out to us. So with that, let's get to some questions. Great. Well, first, I just wanted to open it to our panelists with a basic question. So David, Jacot, just how do you kind of react to some of what you've heard today from the Berkeley Lab guys and some of the stuff that Kevin was sharing as well from his experience?
Yeah, well, two things pop to mind. So from the Berkeley folks, it's very heartening to hear, and it's the recognition that the technology already exists. This is not an R&D. I mean, there will obviously be ongoing R&D in the space, but it already exists. So that's heartening, because once if the technology is actually existing, we can move forward with programs to implement it. And then from the GSA side, equally, it's heartening to see a huge entity already doing this. That gives a lot of credibility in a marketplace to vetting the technology. And so we kind of have it captured at both ends to say, the space is really ripe for this. The technology exists and somebody's already doing it. And so my job is to take this from somebody doing it to eventually everybody doing it. And that's what the utility comes in terms of supporting it, incentivizing it, reaping the benefits of it. And like I said, getting us to the low end of that electrification range investment as opposed to the high end.
Absolutely. And that difference is a huge one. As you said, $30 billion is nothing to sneeze at. We talked a lot about, it is heartening to hear that, the scope is reasonably clear. We know what this is. I think a lot of people are like, okay, yeah, I understand. I got some projects like this. The technology is here. What if I have a dumb building? What if so you guys, we're gonna not necessarily, or did you choose some hard ones, Kevin, as you were going out? Or did you choose more like kind of GEB ready sites? So maybe there's two questions there. What did you choose? And then what if I have a dumb building and I want to, start
Yeah.
heading this direction? How do I think about that?
Well, yeah. So the first piece to this is so one of the ways that our program works is we do try to pick representative buildings. And we don't pick the easiest ones, because if we just pick the easiest ones, then we wouldn't actually know as much as by picking the harder ones. We take that, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere kind of approach. Said, as I say, GSA has been out front for a while, and we have invested heavily over the past decade, I'd say, in particular in essentially smart building technologies. And could you really do this with a super dumb building? I think you can. Are we looking at that for ourselves? We're not, because that's not our buildings.
Right.
But there's as a sort of I guess a reference point, and I don't want to have this come out the wrong way, but within the same program, so we do this jointly with DOE. And there is a DOE, there are a couple of DOE buildings that one is actually a administrative office of the California courts or whatever they're called, but it's a courts building. It's a small court, and I think it's actually in Southern California. That's a pretty dumb building. And they're putting in a system that has been incredibly helpful and making that a much smarter building without a lot of lift. So that's possible. And there's another building in Colorado that's a school building that I will say is a very dumb building. And that is to say, there's just not a lot, there's nothing that's connected to anything there. And it's a lot of, as is the case in many school districts, has not seen a lot of investment. And that one is also going to be connected up, and I think in a way that will make it much smarter. So there's a lot out there to do that.
Well, it'll be great to circle back with you, like you said, a year from now and see how things are going, and as we've been doing on some of these other pilots. So that's great. David Jacot, you pointed out that in California, something on the order of 41%, if we're looking at emissions, 41% of emissions are really coming from transportation. And looking at load growth from electrification of transportation being a 2 or 2.5x in addition to building electrification on DWP's end. Could we talk a little bit more about the sort of vehicle electrification component here and sort of the department's efforts in that area? Just a quick update. I know it's not directly in your shop, but I wanted to pick up on that and see if there are any best practices or insights that others of the speakers want to chime in on that.
Sure. It's an all of the above strategy. We've got to get the chargers out there, chicken and egg, the whole thing.
Yeah.
People are reticent about buying electric vehicles because of the charging situation, and you got to get the chargers out there you have to have enough electric vehicles to support a widespread charging system. The good news is electricity is everywhere. This isn't like trying to build out a hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure where you started from scratch. Electricity is everywhere. So it's just a matter of making sure the service can handle it and upgrade it. So that's easy, relatively speaking, of course. But let me just say this one thing about why electrification transportation is so important to us achieving the LA 100 targets. I mentioned earlier that if we stage this properly, we anticipate rates rise with inflation, which means this thing kind of pays for itself. That, when I say it pays for itself, that requires massive electrification, specifically in transportation. That's going to be our big push in the next, certainly 5 years, but going forward, and we have to, and this is where the GEBs come in, and smart buildings and smart charging and flexible demand comes in. and EVs are perfectly primed for that. But we have plenty of capacity on our system at various times of the day. The peak is, when the peak hits, and then we have troughs where we're barely utilizing the system at all at 5–10%. So, we can accommodate massive amounts of transportation electrification onto the grid as long as it, charges at the right times. If we don't get that transportation electrification, then our rate picture is much starker to achieve the LA 100 targets, because we won't have that revenue that is basically gravy on top of existing infrastructure. So that is, it's going to be a real push for us in the next 5 years to dramatically ramp up electric vehicles in LA.
Andy or Ryan, I wonder if this is sort of resonating for you, or light bulbs are going off as you've been taking this national look, and you guys showed an interesting slide that sort of made it really clear the difference when we're looking through a GHG lens of the value of saving energy right at different times of day. In California, way different than in the Midwest, for example. I think it was real clear in that graphic. So yeah, how do you kind of react to what you're hearing in David's strategy here in LA and the transit, the importance of transit? How do you kind of see that in the context of the research you guys have been doing, barriers, opportunities?
Yeah, I think the one aspect of it that certainly resonates with me is, David said it's all about right time, right? It's the right time to get these vehicles to charge at a time when capacity factor, utilization rates, and all that the system can accommodate. And so I think one of the things, actually, sort of more personally for my research, and actually this is something Ryan has worked for a long time in, is really about pricing, right? How can we get the pricing for electricity right to encourage customer loads, right, to shift into the time periods when we need them, and to drive that right time. This was what I like about the GEB roadmap is it treats sort of the economics and the engineering perspective very equally, right? That there are important building technology engineering solutions out there, and there's important sort of just getting the pricing right and getting incentive signals correct. And that both of those need to happen, right, to achieve the benefits that we talked about. So I certainly see that right time element from a pricing perspective is really important.
Yeah, and the right time to be focusing on this is now, I think, with the explosion of electric vehicle models that we're going to be seeing coming on the market in the next couple of years, and auto manufacturers reworking their entire assembly lines to orient around electric vehicles. Like, we have actually, I think, a fairly short period of time before we reach an inflection point, and we'll need to deal with some of those EV integration challenges that David was describing. So it might feel like that's still a ways off, but there's not a huge investment that's required to develop a effective EV time of use rate. So this is the right time to be working on that before it's too late.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you, guys. We're just over time. I think we could all go for hours. So thank you again. Really appreciate the time and the resources, and appreciate everybody joining us. Tune in for next month. Don't miss the tech showcase, and watch your inbox tomorrow. We'll get the summary and all the goodies for you. Thank you, guys. This was awesome.